It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a group of friends venturing into the wilderness for a camping trip. Nothing out of the ordinary. But when I look back at it now, I realize how much I underestimated the forest and what it harbored in its dark corners. It all started with me, Dave, my best friend Rick, and our two other friends, Carl and Mike, who had been planning this trip for months. The plan was simple: drive up to a secluded camping spot in the Adirondacks, set up camp, cook some food, and just enjoy the quiet of the woods. We figured it would be the perfect escape from the city. The first night was calm, too calm. Looking back, the air was cool, crisp, and the only sounds were the crackling of the campfire and the occasional rustling of leaves. We spent hours just sitting around the fire, telling ghost stories, laughing and joking. But as the night went on, I noticed something odd. Every time we glanced into the woods, there seemed to be a strange movement just outside the circle of firelight, like something was watching us. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but the others were already staring into the darkness. "What?" Rick asked, shifting uncomfortably. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know," I replied, my heart starting to race. "Something just moved over there." At first, they dismissed it. "It's just the wind," Carl said. "Nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We decided to go to bed after a while, but as I lay in my tent, I couldn't sleep. The sounds of the forest were different, too quiet. And then I heard it. A faint rustling, not from the trees or the animals. It was deliberate. Footsteps. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, listening intently. They were soft but unmistakable. The steps circled around the camp, and I realized they were heading straight for our tents. My heart hammered in my chest. Suddenly, a scream, Carl's. We all bolted out of our tents at once. Carl was standing by the edge of the camp, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He was pointing into the woods, but he couldn't speak. His voice was caught in his throat. "What's wrong?" Mike shouted, trying to grab him, but Carl just shook his head, still unable to speak. That's when we saw it too. A figure, tall, cloaked in black, and standing just at the edge of the tree line. We couldn't see its face, but its presence was undeniable. We all stared at it, paralyzed in fear. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. I don't know how long we stood there, in shock, just staring at the empty darkness. It felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few minutes before we gathered enough sense to speak. "Did anyone else see that?" Rick asked, his voice trembling. There was no denying it. We had all seen it. "We need to get out of here," I said, my instincts kicking in. "Now." But something stopped us from leaving immediately. A feeling I can't explain. Something in the air, something we couldn't shake. We gathered our things, but every movement felt too loud. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something chilling. The figure wasn't the only thing watching us. There were more of them moving just beyond the tree line. Shapes, shifting between the trunks of the trees. Some were far away, others closer, but all were watching. Rick, the most practical one of us, kept saying it was our minds playing tricks, that we were just seeing things. But I knew better. I could feel their eyes on us. We didn't stay much longer that night. We packed everything up as quickly as we could and got into the truck. I glanced one last time into the woods before we drove off. Two pale faces staring back at me from the shadows. What I didn't know then was that our real nightmare was just beginning. That was only the first part of the trip, and it would end with none of us being the same again. We didn't talk much as we drove down the winding forest road, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in after we left camp. The silence in the truck was suffocating, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. Carl was still in shock, barely saying a word, his eyes wide and constantly darting to the rearview mirror. Mike, usually the loudest in the group, was now unnervingly quiet. Only Rick and I spoke, and even then, it was just about the quickest route out of there. The road seemed endless, winding through the forest like a never-ending tunnel. As we drove further away from the campsite, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was worse now. We were on a well-traveled road, but there was still this unsettling sensation that something was just beyond the trees, waiting for us to make a mistake. Rick, trying to make sense of it all, spoke up. "It has to be a prank. Someone must have been out there, messing with us." I wanted to believe that, I really did. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something about the way that figure moved, the unnatural stillness it exuded, that made me question every instinct I had. We reached a fork in the road, and that's when it all went wrong. The truck sputtered, then stalled. Rick cursed under his breath, trying to restart the engine, but it was no use. The battery was dead. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, banging his fist on the dashboard. "We were just driving fine." I looked around nervously, trying to stay calm, but I could feel it, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I thought I saw movement in the trees again, a shadow that didn't belong. And then a low growl. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it was so loud I felt it in my chest. "Get out. Now!" I shouted, grabbing the door handle. We didn't need to wait any longer. Something was out there, and it was coming for us. We all scrambled out of the truck, but the moment we stepped into the woods, the growl turned into a howl. It was deafening. Carl screamed and tried to run, but we all heard it. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, not just one set, but several, closing in fast. Rick, normally the level-headed one, was panicking now. "We need to get back to the truck." But it was too late. The woods were alive with movement. Shapes flickered in and out of the trees. They were fast. Too fast. We made a break for it, running blindly through the thick underbrush, our breath ragged, the sounds of pursuit growing louder with each passing second. But no matter how fast we ran, it felt like they were always just behind us. Then Carl went down. A scream ripped through the air, and we turned to see him struggling on the ground, his face twisted in terror. Something was dragging him into the shadows, and no matter how much we yelled, no one came to help him. It happened too quickly. By the time we reached him, Carl was gone. His body had been dragged into the woods, and the only evidence of his struggle was a trail of blood that led into the dark abyss of the trees. We stood there for a moment, frozen in horror. I wanted to move, to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't obey. And then, I heard it again, the growl, but this time it was right behind me. I turned to face it, heart pounding in my chest. The thing that had taken Carl stepped into the dim light, just beyond the tree line. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with a twisted, almost human shape, but its face was wrong. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and sickly, and its eyes, those eyes were yellow, gleaming in the darkness like a predator watching its prey. I could barely breathe as I stared at it, feeling every ounce of my body scream to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It tilted its head, like it was studying us, and for a moment, I thought it might just leave us alone. But then, it opened its mouth. The sound that came out of it wasn't anything human. It was a guttural screech, a noise that made my blood run cold. And that's when I knew this thing wasn't just watching us. It was hunting us. The ground beneath me suddenly gave way, and I tumbled into a ravine. I don't remember much about that fall, only that when I hit the bottom, everything went black. I woke up hours later, disoriented, with only the sounds of the forest to keep me company. The others were gone. Rick, Mike, they had vanished. I was alone, battered and bruised, but somehow still alive. The only thing left now was the question. Why? Why hadn't it killed me? And what had happened to my friends? As I sat there, trying to piece together what had just happened, I realized the worst part. Whatever it was that hunted us, it wasn't done yet. And I had no idea when it would come back. When I woke up in that ravine, it felt like the world had been erased. No noise except for the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant call of an owl. Everything was eerily still, like the forest was holding its breath. But it didn't feel peaceful. No, it felt like the calm before a storm. I couldn't stay in the ravine. Carl, Rick, and Mike. They were out there somewhere, and I had to find them, even though every instinct screamed at me to get out of the woods as fast as possible. But I had no idea which direction to go. The woods all looked the same. The trees, the underbrush, the narrow trails. It was like a maze that had no end. I forced myself to stand, my body aching from the fall, my mind still foggy from the terror I just experienced. My head was spinning, but one thing was clear. I couldn't leave without knowing what happened to my friends. I made my way through the woods, moving cautiously, trying to retrace our steps from the night before. The weight of what had happened kept pulling at me. Carl had been dragged away, Mike and Rick had disappeared into the night, and I was alone, completely alone. The figure we'd seen, the one that watched us, hadn't just been some sick prank. It was something far worse. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows through the trees. It felt like hours had passed since I'd last seen my friends, but it was probably only a few minutes. I stopped to catch my breath, scanning the woods. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't the natural silence of a forest at night. No, this was something else. An oppressive quiet, like the forest itself was waiting. That's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, just like the one from last night, standing motionless at the edge of the trees. I froze. It didn't move, didn't even twitch, but I knew it was watching me. My heart was in my throat, and I could feel the cold sweat dripping down my back. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't cooperate. All I could do was stare at it, waiting for it to make its move. But then, it did something unexpected. It stepped forward, slowly, one deliberate footfall after another, until it was standing in the open, illuminated by the dying light of the sun. The figure wasn't human, it wasn't anything close. Its skin was stretched tight, pale as bone, with long, gnarled limbs. Its face, or what was left of it, was featureless, smooth and contorted, with holes where eyes should be. And its mouth was wide, unnaturally wide, stretching across its face like a grotesque grin. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare, paralyzed with fear, as it took another step toward me. But then, as if the figure had decided it was no longer interested in me, it stopped. It tilted its head at a strange angle, almost like it was curious. And then, it turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. For a moment, I just stood there, blinking, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Was it playing with me, or was it letting me go? I didn't have time to figure it out. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and I heard the unmistakable sound of movement all around me. The trees were shifting, the wind picked up, and then something far more terrifying than the figure appeared. A low growl. It was the same growl I had heard before, only this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me, and it was getting louder, closer. I turned, my heart racing, and saw it. It wasn't just one figure anymore. There were others, shapes, shadows, flickering between the trees, moving in unison, circling around me. Their eyes, yellow, gleaming, were fixed on me, burning with hunger. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, stumbling through the underbrush, not knowing where I was going, but knowing that staying still meant certain death. The ground beneath me seemed to give way, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow me whole. I didn't dare look back. Every part of me screamed to keep running. But then I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A scream, not from a person, but from something else, a horrible, inhuman sound, echoing through the trees. It sounded like Mike, or maybe Rick, or maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore it. I forced myself to keep moving, pushing through the pain, trying to block out the terror rising in my chest. I couldn't lose them, not without at least knowing what had happened. And then I saw it, a flicker of movement, something small, crouching in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the trees. It was Mike. He was alive. His clothes were torn, his face pale and covered in dirt, but he was breathing. His eyes were wide with terror, and he was staring at something in the distance, something that I couldn't see. I rushed toward him, calling his name, but he didn't respond. It was like he was in a trance, his body frozen, unable to move. That's when I saw it, standing just behind him. The figure, the thing that had been hunting us. I had no time to think. I grabbed Mike, pulling him away, but he wouldn't move. He was stuck, paralyzed by fear. I could feel the presence behind us, closing in. There was no time left. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my knife. I had no idea if it would do anything against whatever was stalking us, but I wasn't going down without a fight. The moment I unsheathed the blade, the figure lunged. I didn't have time to react. The creature lunged at us, faster than anything I had ever seen. In the split second that it closed the distance between us, I felt the air around me thicken, as if the very forest itself was closing in, wrapping us in its suffocating grip. I grabbed Mike and pulled him to the ground, rolling us both out of its path, but just barely. I could hear its ragged breathing as it passed over us, its twisted limbs scraping against the dirt and trees. My heart pounded in my chest, but we were alive, for now. I yanked Mike to his feet, trying to steady him as he stood, his body trembling, his eyes unfocused. It was clear now that whatever had happened to him, whatever had taken hold of him in that moment, had driven him to the edge. But I couldn't think about that right now. We were in the middle of a hunt, and we were its prey. I forced him to move, dragging him behind me, but I could feel the eyes of the creatures on us, as if they were toying with us. There was something deliberate about their movements. It wasn't just about killing us, it was about torment. The forest was alive with their presence, shadows moving just beyond the light, the trees closing in tighter with every step. I looked back once and saw them, 4 of them, maybe 5, glaring at us from the edge of the trees. They didn't rush us, no. They let us run. They watched us. They let the fear build until we were trembling, until we were almost too exhausted to keep moving. But there was no choice. I couldn't let them take Mike, not like they had taken Carl. We had to find a way out of this forest. I pulled Mike toward what I hoped was the direction of the road. I had no idea how far we'd run or which way we'd turned, but if we could just make it to the road, we might have a chance. Then, as if the forest decided to end our futile attempts at escape, the ground shifted again. This time, it wasn't just the trees. The entire forest seemed to grow silent, unnaturally silent, and the air grew colder, sharper. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. I could hear a low hum, vibrating beneath my feet, coming from deep within the earth. The creatures were moving closer, their growls merging with the hum. It was a sound I'll never forget, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to pierce my skull. And then, a voice. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It was an ancient voice, deep, primal, and full of rage. It echoed around me, surrounding me, crawling into my very bones. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered, filling the space between the trees. "The forest knows you now. You belong to it." I froze, my body refusing to move as the ground beneath me seemed to shift again, the hum growing louder, the air pressing in on me. Mike stood beside me, his body stiff, his face pale, and his eyes wide with terror. He couldn't move either. And then, out of nowhere, the voice stopped. The silence was deafening, but in that silence, something else began. A rustling, not from the creatures, but from deeper in the forest. It was unmistakable, a soft sound like footsteps, but the kind of footsteps that left a mark, the kind that meant something heavy, something massive was approaching. I slowly turned to look behind us, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a figure this time. It was an army. Emerging from the woods were dozens, no hundreds, of creatures, twisted, contorted, and grotesque, each one more horrific than the last. Their pale faces gleamed under the dim moonlight, their yellow eyes locked onto us as they moved as one. They were silent, too silent, but their presence alone was enough to drive a man mad. They circled us, a wall of flesh and shadow, closing in. I looked at Mike, who was no longer standing with me. He had collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want to die," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Please, no more." I didn't know what to do. My mind was blank, my body frozen in fear. I couldn't see a way out. But then something happened, something I'll never be able to explain. The creatures stopped. Every single one of them, in unison, froze in place. The ground rumbled again, and I could feel the air around me thickening. It was as if something was coming. I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was everywhere, inside my head, in my soul. It was the voice of the forest itself, ancient and powerful. "You are not the first to enter," the voice said, this time a deep rumbling that shook my bones. "And you will not be the last." And then, as quickly as it all began, everything went still. The creatures faded back into the trees, vanishing into the dark like they were never there at all. The hum in the air ceased, and the ground beneath me stopped vibrating. Mike was still kneeling, but he seemed calmer now, like the grip of terror had loosened just enough for him to breathe again. I didn't know what to make of this sudden shift in the atmosphere. Was it over? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The forest was still watching, still waiting. Whatever force was behind this, it had let us go, for now. I grabbed Mike, pulling him to his feet, and without saying a word, we stumbled through the trees, moving faster than we ever had. We didn't look back. We couldn't. We finally reached the edge of the woods, the road just ahead. The truck was still there, parked in the same spot where we had left it, its engine silent. I don't know how we made it out of that forest. I don't know what stopped the creatures from finishing what they started. But we were alive, for now. And as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still out there, watching us, waiting for us to return. And it would, sooner or later. It always does. The drive back was a blur. Mike and I barely said a word to each other, the silence between us thick with unspoken terror. The road stretched endlessly in front of us, a lifeline that seemed to lead to nowhere. It felt like a dream, no, a nightmare. But it was real, too real. We were both shaken to our core, our minds still processing everything we'd just gone through. We reached the nearest town, a small, sleepy place that felt like a distant memory compared to the horror we had left behind. But even in the safety of the town, something was wrong. The air felt heavy, like it was clinging to me, holding me back. Every corner I turned, every person I saw, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't done, that whatever was in those woods had followed us. Mike had already started to shut down. He barely spoke and refused to sleep, spending his nights staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. I tried to reach out to him, but he would just shake his head, as if he was seeing something I couldn't, something that wouldn't let him rest. I knew we needed help, but where could we go? Who would believe us? We hadn't just witnessed something evil, we had survived it. Weeks passed, and life in the town slowly resumed its normal pace. But I couldn't forget. The images haunted my dreams, the howls, the creatures with their yellow eyes, the way they circled us. It was all I could think about. Every time I went into the woods near the town, I felt the air shift. The hairs on the back of my neck would rise, my chest would tighten, and I would hear it again. The low hum, the sound of something waiting just beneath the earth. One night, I decided to go back to the woods. I needed answers. I needed to know why. Why had they let us go? Why hadn't they finished what they started? I drove out to the edge of the forest, my hands shaking on the wheel. As I parked by the entrance, I could feel the cold creeping in. The trees stood tall and dark, like silent sentinels, watching me. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the air felt unnaturally still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I stepped out of the truck, my breath visible in the cold night air. There was no sound, nothing, just an overwhelming silence. But then I heard it, a whisper, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. It was a voice, the same voice that had spoken to me before, deep and ancient, coming from somewhere deep within the forest. But this time it wasn't just words. It was a warning. You shouldn't have returned. The voice echoed in my mind, and I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I should turn around, get back in the truck, and never look back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if the forest had a grip on me, pulling me in. I stepped forward, my feet moving on their own. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, and I could feel something moving in the trees, just beyond my vision. The hum, that deep, vibrating sound, started again, low and sinister. It was closer this time, much closer. I didn't see them at first. The creatures, they were hidden in the shadows, but I could feel their presence. The air grew heavier, and then there it was, a flicker of movement, just at the edge of my sight. A pale face, glowing faintly in the dark. And then another, and another. They were surrounding me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was trapped. The creatures emerged from the trees, their twisted forms stepping into the dim light. There were more of them now, too many to count. They moved in silence, their hollow eyes locked onto me, watching. And in the distance, I could hear the unmistakable sound of something else. Something larger. Something more powerful. The voice spoke again, but this time it was different. There was no malice in it, only resignation. You shouldn't have returned, it said again, but this time I understood. This is where you belong now. I didn't know what it meant, but I understood it, deep in my bones. The forest had claimed me. Before I could react, a sharp pain exploded in my chest, and I stumbled backward. It wasn't from the creatures, it was from something else. A force, a presence that gripped me, tightened around my chest like a vice. My breath was shallow, my vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, the creatures gone. The forest was still, quiet, but I wasn't alone. Mike was standing over me, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. "They've come for you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're here for both of us." I tried to stand, but my body wouldn't obey. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, as if it were absorbing me, pulling me into its depths. I looked up at Mike, his face twisted with fear, and then I realized the creatures weren't just in the woods. They were in him, too. They had followed him, followed me. They had been waiting for this moment, for our return. And the worst part? We couldn't escape. We were already part of it. The forest had claimed us, and no one ever truly leaves. I woke up again, though I wasn't sure if I was truly awake. It was the kind of waking that felt like drowning, heavy, disorienting, as if my body wasn't my own anymore. The air around me was thick, and the trees seemed to lean in, their branches creaking in the wind that wasn't really there. Mike was gone. I didn't have to search for him. I knew. The forest had claimed him too. There was no trace of his panic-stricken face, no sign of the fear he had shown earlier, just a hollow silence where his presence had once been. The creatures, they were still here, somewhere close by, hidden in the shadows, watching me, waiting. I tried to move, but it was like the earth itself was holding me in place. Every step I took felt like I was walking through molasses, the ground beneath me giving way slightly with each movement, pulling me down as if the forest wanted me to stay. The same feeling from before, the cold grip of the trees, the deep hum that seemed to pulse through my veins. "You're ours now," the voice spoke again, so close this time it made my skin crawl. It wasn't the voice of a single entity anymore. It was collective, a chorus of many, filling the air with their whispering words. The forest had no singular voice. It had become one with everything here. I couldn't see the creatures, but I could feel them, close, moving in the periphery, their presence overwhelming. I couldn't escape. The ground felt like quicksand. The trees were closing in, and the light of the moon had disappeared entirely behind a curtain of thick, suffocating clouds. I was starting to understand. This was it. I was never meant to leave. None of us were. The forest had watched us, had played with us, had lured us in, and now it was time to pay the price. There was no way out. Not physically, not mentally. The moment I had set foot in these woods, I had entered something ancient, something beyond our understanding. It wasn't just a creature or a supernatural force. It was the land itself, alive, hungry, and vengeful. And as the creatures emerged from the trees, I saw them in full, their bodies twisted and malformed. Their eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, locked onto mine with the coldest, deepest hunger. They weren't there to kill. They were there to claim, to absorb, to turn me into something I wasn't anymore, something they needed. They moved toward me, slow and deliberate, as if the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Their pale, ghastly faces twisted in grotesque expressions of both triumph and sorrow. "You are part of us now," the voice said again, but it was different this time. There was no malice, no rage, only acceptance. "Welcome home." I tried to scream, tried to fight, but the energy had been drained from me. It was like I was fading, becoming nothing. And then the forest took me. It wasn't violent. It wasn't sudden. It was as if the woods had opened up its arms and embraced me, swallowing me whole without resistance. There was no pain, no struggle, just nothing. But I could still feel them, still hear them being the forest, the creatures, the ancient forces that had claimed me. And then silence. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like days, maybe weeks, but it was hard to tell when everything around me seemed both still and endless. My body, no longer mine, felt heavy, like I had been absorbed into the earth itself, part of the trees, the dirt, the air. It wasn't until much later, when I began to understand that the forest wasn't just a place, but a living, breathing thing, that I truly realized what had happened. The forest doesn't kill. It doesn't destroy, consumes. I am now part of it, just like Carl, just like Rick, and just like Mike. We are its new limbs, its new breath. We are the ones who keep it alive, who keep it watching, waiting. And we will never leave. Not because we can't, but because we don't want to anymore. Because we've become the forest. And the forest will always come for you.